All right, y'all ready for the good one? That's pretty good, but you ready for the good one? Good one? Some of y'all will know this one by heart. The Maco Light. How many of y'all here saw the Mako Light? Well, a lot of people have been there. Did you see the light? I saw the light. I saw the light 2 times. Anybody else? All right. This is Brunswick County's most famous, one of its most famous legends. And arguably, not only the most famous ghost story in the Lower Cape Feeder, but North Carolina's most famous ghost story. Now I'll come to that. In search of the Mako Light. Now's that time of year, of course. We just got past Halloween. It always makes for a good Halloween talk. In fact, last week I gave it at the Railroad Museum just before Halloween. Full house. And that was the main story. Now, Mako is an unincorporated rural community 14 miles west of Wilmington in North Brunswick County. On what was then the Wilmington and Manchester Railroad. Wilmington was a railroad town between 1840 and 1960, when the Atlantic Coast Line picked up stakes and pulled up stakes and moved its headquarters to Jacksonville, Florida. I remember this because I rode on Santa Claus's last train in December of 1959, when the sled rolled into Rocky Point. And school children met Santa and Mrs. Claus at Rocky Point, got on the Santa Claus train and rode into downtown Wilmington, where the Railroad Museum is today. The first railroad in Wilmington was the Wilmington and Weldon Railroad, completed in March of 1840. And my wife Nancy said, right there, my better 3/4 for sure, always reminds me, be sure to tell the audiences that when the Wilmington-Weldon Railroad was completed in 1840, at 161.5 miles long from Wilmington to Goldsboro to Weldon, North Carolina, it was the longest railroad in the world. It's true. And then by the time of the Civil War, there were 2 other railroads that tapped into Wilmington, one of them being the Wilmington-Manchester Railroad, which connected Wilmington to Manchester, South Carolina, and then to Charleston. It later would become the Wilmington, Columbia, and Augusta Railroad, Wilmington to Columbia, South Carolina to Augusta, Georgia, where the Masters is held. And then it became the part of the Atlantic Coastline Railroad, and then CSX. Now, early on, Mako, and you can see it. Oh, I've got a clicker with a light. Nancy just bought this. Let me see if I can get it to work. Oh, no, it doesn't work. I'll use the old-fashioned pointer. There's Mako. So it's in Brunswick County. Early on, Mako was called Farmers Turnout. It's just farmers on this. But farmers lived in that area. And they would put their lumber in their naval stores onto the railroad for shipment into Wilmington for processing and then export from the region, maybe from the state. Now, the area was developed by Hugh McRae, who was a native Wilmingtonian MIT graduate, who returned to Wilmington, started the Tidewater Power Company. He got involved in the Wilmington Cotton Mills, developed the railroad from downtown Wilmington to Riceville Beach, the Lumina Theater. He was also involved in the riot of 1898, but that's another story for another day. But in the early 20th century, he developed 6 European agribusiness colonies in what is today Pender County, New Hanover County, and Brunswick County. With his Carolina Trucking Development Company, because what he did was he offered land, and he owned land from the coast to the mountains. And he offered land in the Lower Cape Fear to Europeans who would come and settle here and get into truck farming. growing fruits and flowers and vegetables for local consumption and then for market distribution outside the area. And so out of that was developed Castle Hayne, St. Helena, New Berlin, or what today, of course, we know as Delco, and 3 other colonies that were successful. What I discovered that other historians had not found was that he had planned a 7th colony to be called Mako or Morocco. I don't know what he called it. In West Brunswick County, on what was then the Wilmington, Columbia, and Augusta Railroad. There was already a Catholic church out there, farmers turnout. So he improved the railroad depot, built a school, and planned this development for Italians. But the Italians didn't come. Midwestern farmers didn't come. No one settled that area to grow anything, because what could you grow in the sandhills of West Brunswick County except loblolly pine trees and sedge? In many areas in our region, we're just on top of Old Beach Bottom. Locals in the area called it Rattlesnake because of all the reptiles that dominated the sandhills and the swamps of West Brunswick County. I ran across one newspaper article where 2 hunters killed a big giant seething coil of about 20 or 30 rattlesnakes. Now, what do you call a big giant herd of rattlesnakes? Nancy looked it up. You know what you call it? A Roomba. R-H-U-M-B-A, a Roomba of rattlesnakes. Like they're doing, well, they are. They're doing a dance. Not that Roomba, but R-H-U-M-B-A. They're doing a Roomba. The railroad men called that Rattlesnake Grade because when you got about 12 miles out of Wilmington, you hit Hood or Hood's Creek, and then the railroad went up for a couple miles to what they call Rattlesnake Grade. So the area was known as Rattlesnake or Rattlesnake Grade to the railroad men. But officially it was farmers' turnout until Hugh McRae named it Morocco. But no one came to settle the area. And so the locals, by 1917, had shortened Morocco to Mako. As Johnny Carson used to say, I did not know that. So it did not become famous for being a European agribusiness colony. It became famous for its ghost light. Now the legend is, according to Lewis T. Moore, that shortly after the Civil War, 1867 or 1868, a railroad conductor by the name of Joe Baldwin was killed in a terrible nighttime train accident. The car in which he was riding, the last car of his train, the caboose, had become uncoupled near Hood's Creek and slowly came to a stop at Mako Station, or what would have been Farmers Turnout Station then. Knowing that there was another train following close behind and would be approaching him rapidly, Baldwin ran to the back of the car and frantically waved his lantern in an effort to warn the engineer of the oncoming train of his dilemma. To no avail. The other train smashed into Joe Baldwin's car, making a total wreck of it. Joe Baldwin's lantern flew up and off into a nearby swamp where it burned brightly for a little while and then dimmed, as did the life of Joe Baldwin. His head allegedly severed in the train accident. And shortly afterward, sure enough, people in the area started seeing this strange orb of light that emanated near Hood's Creek, and they grew and moved up and down the railroad tracks, swinging gently back and forth as if someone was looking for something, as if someone were holding a lantern looking for something. They named the lantern Uncle Joe's lantern. Who was Uncle Joe? And they came to believe that whoever Uncle Joe was searching for something. Now let me read to you the earliest account and the best description of the Maco Light that I've ever found. A lady whose last name was Mintz, who lived in Mako in 1964, told a reporter, because there's always a lot of publicity about the Mako Light, particularly around Halloween, that in her 84 years living in Mako, she had seen the light many times, and had from the time she was about 5 or 6 years old. And her father had seen it long before that. So I could trace it back to the 1870s at least. But in 1934, Charles N. Allen, having heard about this light, went and sure enough saw the light. And then wrote an article about it and submitted it for publication in the State magazine, today our State magazine. And here's what he wrote. 1934. A mile or more down the right-of-way, there is a flicker over the left rail as if someone had struck a match. The eerie-looking thing sways a little and begins creeping up the tracks. Your eyes are magically glued to its movements. The thing comes on. It becomes brighter as its momentum increases. Then it begins dashing toward you with incredible velocity. Paralyzed, you just stand there waiting for the thing to rend you to pieces. But it never reaches you. It comes to a sudden halt 50 or 75 yards from where you are standing. It glares at you for a moment like a fiery eye. Then it speeds rapidly back down the tracks. It stops now where it first made its appearance and glows ominously there like a red moon in miniature. Then it vanishes into nothingness. The publisher was incredulous, did not want to publish it, but contacted several Wilmingtonians who said, oh yeah, we've seen the light many times. And so he did publish it, and good thing that he did. It's the best description of the Mako light there is. And pretty much describes the way that most people who saw the light, including me. So, where does the story of Joe Baldwin come in? Louis T. Moore, a collector of stories dating back to colonial times, and good thing that he did, otherwise many of these stories would have been lost to the mists of time. And then he published them in his book, Stories Old and New of the Cape Fear Region. And in a 1948 newspaper article, prior to the publication of his book, the headline read, this is in 1948, Wilmington Morning Star, nowadays Star News. Atlantic coastline favorite ghost story. It still exists, and so does the exciting story. And it is in that newspaper article for the first time that you see the name Joe Baldwin. People in the area call the light Uncle Joe's lantern. But he's put a surname to it, Joe Baldwin. And then the story takes on a life of its own. From that point on, people talk about the Mako light as being the ghost of Joe Baldwin, searching for his head, without which he could never truly rest. The story became so popular nationally that Life magazine, y'all remember Life magazine? Post. Life magazine sent a photographer and reporter to Mako, North Carolina to do a feature article. And that photograph appeared with the story. Now clearly this is staged. And it shows two lights. And even Louis T. Moore said in the 1880s, there were two lights. Sometimes they would merge into one, sometimes they would break apart. And then it just sort of ended up being one light. But in the Life magazine feature article, there were two lights. And a little twist of the story. Joe Baldwin wasn't searching for his head was searching for the body. But this was national publicity. And as popular as it was regionally, imagine the people that it attracted after the Life magazine article appeared in October of 1957. And that probably is what prompted newspaper reporters and the photographer, I think it's Paul Genuine, to go to Mako, and in November of 1957 took one of the very few photographs of the Mako Light. And you can clearly see in the background the light shining off the rails. I thought, thousands of people saw this light for more than 100 years. Surely there must be many photographs of it. There weren't. I was desperate. I called the Star News, I called Ben Steelman, I called anyone I could think of to try and find a photograph. The newspaper's photographic archives had been destroyed. Desperate, I called the Port City Paranormal Group. Post office. Do you know of any lights, photographs of the light? Well, I'm going to come back to that in a moment. So this story took on a life of its own, and particularly around Halloween. You've got these big headlines, you've got these cartoons, but thousands of people saw this light for more than 100 years. Anytime you drove out to Mako, which was a real remote spot, it pretty much is today, but really back in those days it was a remote spot. It was a good place to go parking.
That was that story.
Yeah. I can't because my wife Nancy is with me parking. And she was not the girl I was parking with at Mako. TMI. I tried to explain what parking was to my students, and they had no idea. I knew it was time to retire. You mean like parallel parking? What? But they don't date like we used to date. So anyway, it got a lot of publicity every Halloween, particularly. But thousands of people saw this light. Anytime you went out there would always be a small group of people, sometimes larger than others. And you pulled in off of 74, 76, which at that time was just 2 lanes. Now it's 4 lanes. It looks like Myrtle Beach out there now. Right, it looks like going out toward St. James now. And people would be looking for the light. The light did not come out every night, or so it was said. But then someone had to be there for the light to come out. Get it? So the light might come out right after sunset, it might come out before midnight, it might come out at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. But if there was no one there to see it, the light didn't come out. A friend of mine told me that he and some of his friends went out for 30 consecutive nights and never saw the light. So you were very fortunate if you did see the light. It became so popular that in 1964, the Southeastern Beach Association, which was an early promotional group, kind of like the Chamber of Commerce, invited Hans Holzer, the self-proclaimed expert on ghostism, to come to the area to see the Mako light and try to explain it, because no one had been able to explain its origins. Louis T. Moore wrote that Fort Bragg sent a machine gun battalion down to try and perforate the mystery. I was never able to substantiate that part of the story, but never let a good story get in the way of the truth, right? So Hans Holzer accepted. He had just written his first book called The Ghost Hunter. And before his death, he would write more than 70 books on the supernatural and paranormal. That's his legacy. So they put him up at the newly opened Blockade Runner Beach Resort Hotel at Weissel Beach. Every night, for 3 consecutive nights, they drove him out to Mako. And sure enough, because of all the publicity before his arrival, anytime he went, and every time he went, there were hundreds of people there. So he never saw the light. But that did not prevent him from saying in a public meeting in Brogden Hall in downtown Wilmington that indeed the light was the ghost of Joe Baldwin searching for his head. There is no other explanation. And would you like to buy a copy of my book, which I'll be glad to sign? Well, there is an element of truth in every one of these legends. Something gave birth to these stories, to these myths. My good friend James Burke, who I went to UNCW as an undergraduate with back in the days of the dinosaurs, long before I was a teacher there, working on his PhD dissertation at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, his dissertation topic, North Carolina Antebellum Railroads. And before there was newspapers.com, he was going through newspaper microfilm, and look what he found. 1856. Not 1867 or 1868, as Louis T. Moore said. 1856. Wilmington Daily Herald. Just as we are going to press, we learned that an accident occurred upon the Wilmington-Manchester Road last night at Rattlesnake Grade, by which several persons were more or less injured, among them Mrs. Charles Baldwin. Mr. Baldwin's injuries, it is feared, may result fatally, and sure enough, the late railroad accident, a coroner's jury summoned by Coroner J.C. Wood to examine into the circumstances by which the late lamented Charles Baldwin came to his death, after mature deliberation, as opposed to immature deliberation, report that it was occasioned by a blow received on the head on the night of Friday, the 4th of January, while acting as conductor on the mail train to the Wilmington-Manchester Railroad by a collision of the engine and mail train. So there really was a train accident at that spot. And there really was a railroad conductor named Baldwin who was killed of traumatic head injury. And somehow, some way, Louis T. Moore took that distant memory of the real event and combined it with Uncle Joe's lantern to create, in my opinion, the legend of Joe Baldwin. And then the story took on a life of its own. But there really was a light. And no one was ever able to explain its origin. Not a geologist, not a scientist, not a physicist, not regular folks. Thousands of people saw the light for more than 100 years. What caused it? Phosphate fumes? Swamp gas? The reflection of automobile lights had been seen since the 1870s, long before there were automobiles. What was it? There really was a light.
When's the last time you saw it?
1969. Was the last time. I saw it 2 times in 1969. But this gentleman who took this photograph saw it, he told me, 15 to 20 times. The Cape Fear Paranormal group turned me on to Jim Jocham of Greensboro, North Carolina, now 89 years old. Back in the 1950s, 1960s, into the 70s, he and his first wife and family lived in Winston-Salem. Her family was from Bolivia. So anytime they drove from Winston-Salem to Bolivia, he would stop to try and see the Mako Light. And he told me between 1954, the first time I saw the light, and the early 1970s, I don't remember the last time, I saw the light 15 or 20 times. And if you're serious about this light, and I told him I was when I called him, I'll come down and meet with you and Nancy. He brought his wife and daughter, and we met at the Pilot House, and he talked about the Mako Light. And he said, Chris, in 1958, tired of being teased by my friends about seeing this ghost light at Mako, one of them said, let's see the proof. I'll loan you my camera, but I'll do one better. I'll give you an infrared camera. He worked for Bell South Laboratories. So Joachim said, I went down sometime in 1958, went to Mako, as I always did when we went to Bolivia. I got there, sure enough, there was a group of people. I set up the infrared camera on a tripod. People interested came over to ask me what I was doing, what's going on. We talked for a little while, and then we waited for the light. It got to be 10 o'clock, no light. 11 o'clock came and went, still no light. Midnight, everybody else got bored and went home. I stayed on. And I waited, and I waited, and I waited, and I finally decided the light's not going to come out tonight. So I started to pack up my gear, and sure enough, about 1 o'clock, suddenly the light came on. And as it moved up the railroad tracks, I was able to photograph it, not once, not twice, but 3 times. And it clearly shows a heat source. The very best proof of the existence of the Mako Light. Despite the fact that thousands of people saw it, there is living proof of the existence of the Mako Light. He said, Chris, these photographs have never been seen in public. They've certainly never been published. You're welcome to use them if you tell what happened to me after I made my film exposures. Absolutely, Jim, whatever you want to do. So here's what he wrote. After I made my film exposures of the ghost light from a distance of approximately 300 yards, it was weird. You could never tell how close or how far away you were from the light. I packed up my photo gear, turned and began walking between the railroad tracks back to my car. I suddenly became aware that a bright light was shining over my shoulder, illuminating the rails in front of me. My first thought was, it's a train, because the train still uses that track. I quickly turned around, and there was the Mako Light. It was the closest I had ever seen it, and believe me, the remaining 50 yards to the car was a record run. Thank you all very much. I enjoyed being with you. Okay, I don't want to go over my time.
Does your book have these photos in the book?
Yet, for the first time ever, those photographs are in the book. They've never been published before.
Great story.
The description that you read about the other gentleman, how it came forward very rapidly.
It's all in here.
Yeah, but when you saw it, did it do the same thing? That's the way he described it?
Yes. Well, the 2 times that I saw it, I hope it's not anything I said. Okay. It's what I didn't say. I saw it 2 times. The first time, I was with 3 friends. It looked like that. A glowing orb in the distance, and sure enough, as it moved up the tracks, it was swinging back and forth. Again, as if someone were swinging a lantern. The second time we saw it, the summer of '69, as soon as we drove into the site, and there was no one else there, But the Mako light was right there. As Jim Jocham said, it was the closest I'd ever seen it. It was so bright that we could see the reflection shining in the hood of our car. And we got out of the car and I started walking toward it and it backed up. Or at least that's what my senses experienced. You could never tell how close or how far away you were from the light. But it got smaller. Was it backing up or was it just getting smaller? I could never tell. I don't think anyone could ever tell. But the light really did exist. You might have similar experiences. You went several times and never saw the light. I'm sorry.
My brother-in-law told me the story of the Mako light, but he had never seen it.
He'd never seen
I
it.
went out and I never saw it. But Dave Spencer, you know it,
Oh, yeah, I knew that.
or you knew it.
Yeah.
He's my brother-in-law.
Well, as I said, you were fortunate to see the light. Yes, sir.
Has that photo ever been authenticated by any scientist, maybe, to say that it was not just a made-up image?
Well, I can only go by what Jim Jocham, who took the photographs, told me. I made these images in 1958. I borrowed the infrared camera. It was loaned to me. It was given to me for temporary use by a friend who worked for Bell South Laboratories. And he looked at the photographs and just said, wow, I can't believe it. I mean, there is a heat source there. So I can only go by what Jim Jocham told me. And I don't know, Nancy, he seemed pretty authentic to me. He told us some pretty incredible stories about his experiences seeing the Mako light, which seemed to match up well with other stories that I heard from other people. So, I don't doubt that the photographs are legitimate. Yes, ma'am.
When you was naming some of the sound between Mako and you, I didn't never leave for the pencil.
No, I didn't. And do you want to explain that?
No, because they lied about it, they never heard of it. But I checked into the train and the station from 1910 on up, and that's when I came across the pencil.
Yeah. I saw very few mentions of that. Only Farmers Turnout, and then Morocco, and then Mako. But again, the people who live in the area called it rattlesnake or rattlesnake grave.
So where exactly was the pencil? What area was that in?
I don't know. I don't know if they're referring to that same area or not. I can't answer that. Maybe someone who lives in west or northwest Brunswick County could tell us, but I don't know.
It was, when I was listening, I had a brother coming down from north here, and some of the train that you called, they didn't have on the paper that it was 2 or 3 different trains that were bought by the same people company.
Mm-hmm.
And I was trying to find the log up there because he was killed on a train. And that
Wow.
killed him.
Wow.
And threw him off the train. And so I went back and I was trying to get some information. And when we came across one of the thing was locked, we couldn't get to it. But then a friend of mine got into it and she put all this up.
I don't know if that's the same area or not. The other part of the story is that Grover Cleveland, some of the part of the story goes that he saw the light, but I was able to prove that was not true. On his way back from Cuba and Florida after he shortly left office in 1889, his train did pause at what was then Farmers Turnout. And he got off the train, it was early April morning, and such a beautiful day, he was walking along the tracks and noticed that the conductors were using 2 different colored lights and asked about it and was told about the ghost light. This is 1889. And by some accounts, he saw the light. He never did because it was in the early morning hours of April of 1889, and it did not come out during the day. The light disappeared in 1977 when CSX pulled up the railroad tracks.
77 is the last.
77, December of 77 was the last time the light was seen. And Nancy and I finally found the old spot. It's developed now. The railroad bed has been pushed down. It's a road. There are houses and trailers on both sides of the old rail bed. We drove all the way down to Hoods Creek and back, and there was a gentleman in his front yard. I rolled the window down. I said, is this where Mako, what the Mako Light was? He said, oh yeah, people come down here all the time looking for it, or at least they come to go parking. Thank you all very much.